Good evening. Tonight, we wade into the gritty, the uncertain, and the not-so-glorious side of medicine and murder. Behind every great civilization, every royal court, every medical breakthrough, there lies a darker truth, one written in drops of clear liquid, sprinkled powder, and the final gasps of both enemies and loved ones. Forget the Hollywood versions of cartoonish villains cackling over bubbling cauldrons. The truth about poison is far more intimate, far more tragic, and far more human than any fiction could capture. To live with this knowledge honestly is to understand that the line between healing and killing has always been as thin as the edge of a knife. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Silence your notifications, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's step into tonight's journey together. Before we begin, understand this fundamental truth about poison. The history of poison is the history of the cup. Every civilization, every culture, every generation has passed the cup, sometimes knowingly, sometimes in ignorance, sometimes in the name of healing, sometimes in the name of power, and every time, humanity has had to make the same impossible choice. Do we drink, or do we refuse? Do we trust the hand that offers relief, or do we suspect betrayal in every kindness? This question, as old as consciousness itself, has shaped empires, ended dynasties, revolutionized medicine, and transformed warfare. And tonight, we will trace the arc of that cup from the first human who discovered that certain plants brought sleep that never ended, to the modern physician who must calculate doses measured in micrograms, knowing that the difference between cure and death is often a matter of mathematics. Part 1. The Ancient World, When Gods Gave Gifts of Death. Chapter 1. The First Poison. Discovery in the Dawn of Time. In the beginning there was curiosity, and curiosity, as it has always done, led humanity to taste, to touch, to experiment with the world around them. Somewhere in the deep mists of prehistory, perhaps 50,000 years ago, perhaps longer, a human being made a discovery that would change the trajectory of civilization forever. They discovered that certain plants, certain berries, certain mushrooms did not simply satisfy hunger, they killed. The archaeological record whispers hints of this ancient knowledge. In caves scattered across Europe, Africa and Asia, researchers have found evidence of deliberate poison use dating back to the Upper Paleolithic period. Arrowheads with carefully carved grooves, designed not for aerodynamics, but for holding sticky substances. Bone tubes that once contained concentrated plant extracts. Rock art depicting hunting scenes where animals fall not from the force of the projectile but from something invisible, something that travelled in the weapon's very substance. The first poisons were undoubtedly discovered through tragedy. A child eating the wrong berries and never waking. A family consuming mushrooms that looked identical to their edible cousins, only to die in agony hours later. A wounded animal that had grazed on a particular plant, its flesh making the hunters who consumed it violently ill. But humanity's genius has always been to transform tragedy into technology. Those early observers began to catalogue the world's poisons with the same intensity they mapped hunting grounds and water sources. Because in a world of scarce resources, dangerous predators and hostile competitors, poison represented something revolutionary. The ability to kill from a distance, to bring down prey much larger than oneself, and to do so with a tiny amount of precious material. The San people of southern Africa, whose culture stretches back tens of thousands of years in an unbroken line to some of humanity's earliest ancestors, perfected this art to an astonishing degree. Their poison, derived from the larvae of the Diamphidia beetle and certain indigenous plants, was applied to lightweight arrows that could bring down a full-grown giraffe. But the poison worked slowly, requiring hunters to track their wounded prey for days, sometimes weeks, following the animal as the toxin gradually paralysed its nervous system. This was not quick. This was not clean. This was patience weaponized, death delivered on a timescale that required intimate knowledge of both poison and prey. In the dense rainforests of South America, indigenous tribes discovered their own deadly arsenal. The most famous of these was curare, a dark paste made from the bark of Strychnos toxifera and related plants. The process of making curare was itself a ritual, a sacred knowledge passed from shaman to apprentice. The bark would be scraped, boiled for days, reduced to a thick tar-like substance, and then carefully stored in bamboo tubes sealed with wax. An arrow tipped with curare could paralyze a howler monkey in the canopy within minutes, causing it to lose its grip and fall to the forest floor. The poison worked by blocking the chemical signals between nerves and muscles, effectively disconnecting the brain from the body. The victim remained conscious, aware, their mind trapped in a body that would no longer obey. Death came slowly, through suffocation, as the muscles that controlled breathing simply stopped responding. These early humans understood something profound about poison. It was fundamentally different from other weapons. A spear or club required strength. A bow required skill. But poison required knowledge, and knowledge could be hoarded, controlled, used to establish hierarchy and power. In many early societies, the shaman or medicine man derived much of their authority from their mastery of poisons. They knew which plants healed and which killed. They knew the dosages, the preparations, the antidotes. This made them simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous members of their communities. They were physicians and assassins, healers and executioners, often in the same breath. The transition from hunting poison to homicidal poison was, in evolutionary terms, instantaneous. The same substance that brought down a deer could silence a rival. The same knowledge that fed a family could eliminate a competitor. And unlike violence with weapons, poisoning left few marks, few signs of struggle. A victim who died from poison could appear to have succumbed to natural illness, to the will of the gods, to mysterious forces beyond human understanding. This ambiguity, this deniability, made poison the perfect tool for a species that was beginning to organize itself into complex societies, where murder needed to be more sophisticated than simple violence. Chapter 2. Mesopotamia and Egypt, the birth of systematic poisoning. By the time the first cities rose from the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, around 4500 BCE, humanity had already accumulated thousands of years of empirical knowledge about toxic substances. But what changed with the advent of civilization was the scale, the organization, and the deliberate study of poisons. The Sumerians, those remarkable people who gave the world writing, mathematics, and urban planning, also gave it one of the first systematically documented poison programs. In the great temple complexes and palace archives of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash, scribes working on clay tablets began to compile lists of toxic plants, their effects, and their applications. These were not merely catalogues of botanical curiosities, they were manuals of power. The tablets described substances like henbane, a plant in the nightshade family whose seeds contain powerful hallucinogenic and toxic alkaloids. They mention the opium poppy, not yet refined into its pure forms, but recognized for its ability to bring both relief and death depending on the dose. They catalogue certain mineral salts, early forms of what we would later know as arsenic and mercury compounds, extracted from the earth and purified through primitive but effective methods. The Sumerians understood the concept that would, millennia later, be articulated by Paracelsus as the founding principle of toxicology. The dose makes the poison. They knew that the same opium that soothed a crying infant could kill an adult. They knew that copper salts, used in small amounts to treat skin infections, would cause violent vomiting and death if ingested in larger quantities. This knowledge was considered so valuable that it was restricted to the priest class, who served simultaneously as physicians, pharmacists, and counselors to the kings. But it was in Egypt that poison truly came into its own as both a medical tool and a weapon of statecraft. The ancient Egyptians, with their obsessive interest in death, preservation, and the afterlife, became perhaps the ancient world's foremost experts on poisons. Their medical papyri, particularly the Ebers papyrus dating to approximately 1550 BCE, contain hundreds of prescriptions and remedies, many of which employed substances we now recognize as highly toxic. The Egyptians had access to a remarkable variety of poisons. From the deserts came various venomous creatures, snakes, scorpions, and spiders, whose toxins were carefully extracted and studied. From plants came extracts of hemlock, henbane, and mandrake. From minerals came compounds of lead, copper, and arsenic. But perhaps their most sophisticated poison was one they developed from the common peach and apricot. The Egyptians discovered that the kernels of these fruits contained amygdalin, a compound that, when metabolized, releases cyanide. They learned to extract, concentrate, and preserve this poison, creating one of the ancient world's most effective assassination tools. The case of Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt, illustrates the centrality of poison to Egyptian political culture. When facing capture by Octavian's forces in 30 BCE, Cleopatra did not fall on a sword like a Roman general might. She poisoned herself. The popular legend says she used an asp, a cobra, but this has always been questionable. A cobra bite is painful, unpredictable, and would have left obvious marks. More likely, given what we know of Cleopatra's extensive knowledge of toxicology, she was known to have conducted experiments on prisoners to test various poisons. She used a prepared toxin, possibly a mixture that included opium for peace, hemlock for paralysis, and perhaps a cyanide compound for speed. But before Cleopatra made poison famous through her death, the Egyptians had been using it for centuries as a tool of political murder. Palace intrigues in the New Kingdom period often ended with mysterious deaths following banquets. The position of royal taster was not ceremonial. It was a dangerous profession with high mortality. These unfortunate individuals would sample every dish, every cup of wine, waiting the requisite time to see if they would begin to show symptoms. But clever poisoners found ways around even this precaution. Some poisons could be designed to work slowly, taking hours or even days to manifest. Others could be administered in ways that bypassed the taster entirely, through cosmetics applied to the skin, through aromatic oils used in lamps, through fabrics treated with toxic substances that would be absorbed gradually through contact with skin. Chapter 3. Greece and the Philosophy of Poison. The ancient Greeks, those remarkable thinkers who laid the foundations of Western philosophy, mathematics, and democracy, also made poison into a subject of serious intellectual inquiry. But they approached it differently than the Egyptians. Where the Egyptians saw poison as a tool, the Greeks saw it as a problem to be understood, categorized, and ultimately mastered through reason. The Greek word for poison, pharmakon, is extraordinarily revealing. It means simultaneously poison, medicine, and magic charm. This linguistic trinity captures a profound truth that the Greeks understood intuitively. These three concepts are not separate. The same substance that heals in one dose kills in another. The same knowledge that saves life can end it. The physician and the poisoner drew from the same well of expertise. Only intention separated them. The most famous poison in ancient Greece was, without question, hemlock. This plant, Conium maculatum, grows abundantly in the Mediterranean region. It looks deceptively innocent. White flowers in umbrella-shaped clusters, leaves that resemble parsley. But every part of the plant contains coneine, an alkaloid that attacks the peripheral nervous system, causing progressive paralysis that moves upward from the extremities. The victim remains conscious as their legs become useless, then their arms, then their chest muscles. Finally, the diaphragm fails and they suffocate, fully aware of what is happening but unable to move or speak. This was the poison that killed Socrates in 389 BCE. His execution, vividly described by Plato in the Phaedo, became perhaps the most famous poisoning in history. Socrates was condemned for corrupting the youth of Athens and for impiety, charges that amounted to the political establishment's desire to silence a troublesome questioner. He could have fled Athens or begged for mercy. Instead, he chose to drink the hemlock, using his own death as a final philosophical lesson to his students. Plato's account describes the process in clinical detail. The executioner brought the cup of hemlock mixed with water. Socrates drank it calmly, then was instructed to walk around until his legs grew heavy. He reported a coldness creeping up from his feet. Then he lay down, and the executioner periodically pressed his legs and feet, checking for sensation. Gradually the numbness ascended. When it reached his waist, Socrates reportedly said his final words to his friend Crito: "We owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt, and do not neglect it." Then he died, remaining conscious and rational almost until the end. This death, calm, rational, voluntary, became a model for philosophical martyrdom, and hemlock became forever associated with the death of philosophy itself. But the Greeks did not only use poison for execution, they also sought protection from it, driven by the paranoia of rulers who knew that poison was the preferred weapon of palace intrigue. The most remarkable figure in this quest was Mithridates VI, king of Pontus from 120 to 63 BCE. Mithridates was brilliant, multilingual, militarily gifted, and absolutely convinced that someone was trying to poison him. His paranoia was probably justified. His mother had eliminated several of his relatives through poison to secure his throne. Mithridates embarked on what may be history's first systematic toxicology research program. He collected poisons from across the known world, from Egypt, from India, from the mysterious lands north of the Black Sea. He then conducted experiments on condemned prisoners, giving them various poisons and attempting various antidotes. But most remarkably, he began a program of self-administration. He consumed small, gradually increasing doses of various poisons in an attempt to build up immunity through what we now call Mithridatism. This approach actually works for certain poisons. The body can develop tolerance to some toxins through repeated exposure, as the liver produces more of the enzymes needed to break them down. But Mithridates took this to an extreme that was probably dangerous and certainly obsessive. He eventually developed a universal antidote, a compound called mithridatium that contained small amounts of dozens of different substances, including opium, myrrh, saffron, ginger, and viper flesh. The recipe was famous throughout the ancient world and would be used, with variations, for the next 2,000 years. The irony of Mithridates' story is its ending. In 63 BCE, defeated in battle by the Roman general Pompey, the elderly king decided to poison himself rather than face capture. But his lifelong program of self-immunization had worked too well. The poison had no effect. In desperation, he ordered one of his bodyguards to kill him with a sword. The man who had spent his life becoming immune to poison died by the blade instead. Chapter 4. Rome. When poison became epidemic. If the Greeks philosophized about poison, the Romans weaponized it on an industrial scale. The Roman Empire, with its vast wealth, complex political intrigues, and absolute power concentrated in the hands of emperors and their intimates, created the perfect environment for poison to flourish as a tool of murder. The Roman historian Livy reports that, as early as 331 BCE, long before the empire, the Roman Republic experienced what can only be described as a poison epidemic. A series of mysterious deaths among the patrician class eventually led to an investigation that uncovered a conspiracy of Roman matrons, wives and mothers from the nobility, who had been systematically poisoning their husbands and sons. When confronted, some of these women drank their own concoctions to prove they were harmless medicines, and promptly died. It was one of history's first mass poisonings, and it revealed something disturbing. Poison was not the tool of outsiders or barbarians. It was an inside job, a weapon that the most trusted members of society could deploy against their own families. By the time of the empire, poison had become so common in Roman political life that emperors employed full-time food tasters, maintained extensive security protocols for their meals, and often ate from special vessels said to change colour in the presence of poison. A myth, but one that reveals the depth of their anxiety. Despite all these precautions, Roman emperors fell to poison with remarkable regularity. Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, was almost certainly poisoned, though the details remain murky. The most common account says that his fourth wife, Agrippina, fed him a dish of poisoned mushrooms. Mushrooms were an excellent choice for murder. The death cap mushroom, Amanita phalloides, looks similar to edible varieties and contains amatoxins that destroy the liver over the course of several agonizing days. Claudius apparently survived the initial poisoning but was then administered a second dose, this time on a feather that was thrust down his throat under the pretense of inducing vomiting to help him recover. He died shortly after. Agrippina's motivation was clear. She wanted her son Nero to become emperor. She succeeded, though Nero would later have her killed when she became inconvenient. Nero himself, emperor from 54 to 68 CE, was perhaps Rome's most enthusiastic employer of poison. He maintained a personal poisoner named Locusta, a professional who had been condemned to death for her crimes, but was instead kept alive and employed by the imperial household. When Nero wanted to eliminate Britannicus, Claudius's son and potential rival, he had Locusta prepare a poison. The first attempt failed. The dose was too weak, possibly deliberately so to give Nero plausible deniability. Nero was furious and had Locusta whipped. She prepared a stronger dose, which Nero personally tested on a pig. The animal died instantly. That evening, at a dinner, Britannicus's food taster sampled his drink and found it too hot. Cold water was added to cool it. The cold water contained Locusta's poison. Britannicus drank, convulsed, and died within minutes at the dinner table. He was only 13 years old. Locusta's career ended when Nero fell from power. The new emperor, Galba, had her paraded through Rome in chains and then executed. But during her years of imperial service she had trained dozens of apprentices, and the knowledge of poison-making continued to proliferate through Roman society. The Romans' sophistication with poison extended to the substances they used. While hemlock remained popular, imported from Greece, they also developed expertise with arsenic, particularly the compound we now know as arsenic trioxide. They extracted it from the ores of copper and tin, creating a white powder that was tasteless, odourless, and deadly. Mixed with food or wine, it caused symptoms that mimicked natural illness: stomach cramping, vomiting, diarrhea. Given in small doses over time, it produced a wasting illness that could be mistaken for plague or consumption. Lead too became a Roman poison, though often unintentionally. The Romans used lead extensively in their plumbing. The word itself derives from the Latin plumbum, in their cooking vessels, and most dangerously in their wine. Roman winemakers discovered that boiling grape juice in lead vessels created a sweet syrup called sapa that could preserve and flavour wine. The lead acetate formed in this process was responsible for the sweet taste. Roman aristocrats consumed enormous amounts of lead through their wine, causing chronic poisoning that manifested as gout, sterility, insanity, and early death. Some historians have argued that lead poisoning contributed significantly to the decline of Rome's ruling class, making them sterile, irrational, and prone to early death. The empire may have been poisoned not by its enemies, but by its own culinary choices. Part 2. The Middle Ages. Poison in the Age of Faith. Chapter 5. The Arab Golden Age and the Science of Toxicology. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, much of the accumulated knowledge of the classical world was lost to Europe. Libraries burned, scholars fled, and the sophisticated urban culture that had supported scientific inquiry fragmented into isolated rural communities struggling to survive. But in the Middle East and Central Asia, the Islamic Golden Age preserved and dramatically expanded the knowledge of poisons and their antidotes. Arab and Persian scholars translated the works of Dioscorides, Galen, and other classical authors, but they did not stop at mere preservation. They conducted original research, established the world's first hospitals with dedicated pharmacies, and developed toxicology into something approaching a modern science. The greatest of these scholars was Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, who lived from 854 to 925 CE. Al-Razi was a polymath who wrote extensively on medicine, chemistry, and philosophy. His medical encyclopedia, the Kitab al-Hawi, contained detailed descriptions of poisons, their symptoms, and their treatments. But more importantly, Al-Razi insisted on the importance of careful observation and experimentation. He rejected many of the magical theories surrounding poisons and instead focused on empirical documentation of effects. Al-Razi's contemporary and successor, Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abdullah ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, took this work even further. His masterwork, the Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025 CE, became the most influential medical text in both Islamic and Christian worlds for the next 600 years. The section on poisons is remarkably sophisticated. Avicenna classified toxins by their effects, described the concept of dose-response relationships, and most importantly explicitly discussed addiction as a form of chronic poisoning. But the Islamic world's contribution to poison was not purely scientific. Arab alchemists perfected the distillation of arsenic trioxide into a form so pure and transparent that it was virtually undetectable when mixed with water or food. This inheritance powder, as it came to be known, became the assassin's weapon of choice. Arab chemists also developed sophisticated delivery methods, including poisoned clothing, where garments were soaked in toxic substances that would be absorbed through the skin of the wearer. The knowledge flowed along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and scholars. By the 13th century, when European crusaders encountered Islamic medicine, they were stunned by its sophistication. captured Arab medical texts were translated into Latin, and with them came detailed knowledge of poisons. This knowledge arrived in Europe at precisely the moment when it would find its most enthusiastic application. Chapter 6. Medieval Europe, the Poison Epidemic. Medieval Europe, from roughly 1000 to 1500 CE, experienced what can only be described as an epidemic of poisoning. The combination of political instability, weak legal systems, the ready availability of toxic substances through apothecaries, and the influence of Arabic knowledge created a perfect storm. Poison became so common that historians estimate that among the nobility, homicide by poisoning was more common than death in battle. The problem was partly structural. In medieval society, property and power were inherited, creating constant incentive for the impatient heir to speed up the process. Women, largely excluded from political power, but often having access to kitchens and medicine chests, found poison to be the only weapon available to them against abusive or dangerous husbands. And the legal system, even when it suspected poison, had almost no way to prove it. Autopsies were rare and poorly conducted. The symptoms of poisoning could mimic natural illness, and there were no chemical tests to detect poison in a body. Arsenic remained the poison of choice. Throughout medieval Europe, arsenic compounds were sold openly by apothecaries for legitimate purposes. Rat poison, cosmetics, arsenic-based face powder gave aristocratic women the pale complexion that was fashionable, and in small medicinal doses. This meant that virtually anyone could obtain it without suspicion. A medical text from the period notes matter-of-factly that arsenic is readily available, being sold to anyone who asks for rat-bane or whitening powder. The Church attempted to address the epidemic through moral teaching and the threat of damnation. Poisoning was considered particularly heinous because it was premeditated, cowardly, and often targeted family members, violating the sanctity of the domestic sphere. Poisoners who were caught faced terrible deaths, burial alive, burning or breaking on the wheel. But the chance of being caught was so low that these penalties had limited deterrent effect. One particularly notorious case illustrates the problem. In 1285, in the town of Erfurt in Germany, a wealthy merchant named Matthias died suddenly after a banquet. His son quickly took control of the business. 2 years later, the son's older brother, who had been travelling when their father died, also died suddenly, after dining at his brother's house. The younger son now controlled everything. Over the next decade, 3 more relatives who had claims to the inheritance died under mysterious circumstances. Finally, a servant who had participated in the poisonings confessed to a priest. The priest, bound by the seal of confession, could not report the crime but apparently made the murderer's life so miserable that the man eventually confessed publicly. He was broken on the wheel, but only after revealing that his master, the younger son, had been behind all the murders, carefully eliminating anyone with a claim to the family fortune. The case is instructive not because it was unusual, but because it was typical. Poison moved through medieval Europe like a shadow, and conventional legal and social mechanisms were almost powerless to stop it. Chapter 7. The Borgias and the Renaissance of Poison. If the Middle Ages saw poison as a tool of domestic murder, the Renaissance elevated it to a fine art of statecraft, and no family embodied this dark art more thoroughly than the Borgias of Renaissance Italy. The Borgia family, originally from Spain, rose to power in the late 15th century when Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. Rodrigo and his children, primarily his son Cesare and daughter Lucrezia, became synonymous with poison, intrigue, and ruthless political ambition. Whether all the accusations against them were true is debatable. The Borgias were Spanish in an intensely xenophobic Italian political environment, which meant they attracted rumours and accusations regardless of guilt. But there is no doubt that poison was a central tool of their political strategy. The signature Borgia weapon was a white powder called Cantarella, supposedly a secret family recipe. The exact composition remains unknown, though most historians believe it was a refined form of arsenic trioxide mixed with phosphorus. The Borgias reportedly kept this powder in a special container shaped like a key, worn on a chain around the neck. This way, the poison was always accessible, and could be quickly deployed when opportunity arose. The method of administration was often sophisticated. At papal banquets, where hundreds might dine, the Borgias could not simply poison a wine bottle. The wrong person might drink from it. Instead, they allegedly employed targeted delivery methods. One technique involved hollow rings that could dispense powder into a cup while shaking hands or making a toast. Another involved specially prepared candies or confections offered to the target. Still another, particularly cold-blooded, involved waiting until a victim was ill with natural causes, then sending them medicine laced with poison. The victim would die, and observers would attribute it to their existing illness. Cesare Borgia, who inspired Machiavelli's The Prince, used poison extensively in his campaign to carve out a personal kingdom in central Italy. Rivals would be invited to reconciliation dinners and never leave alive. Wealthy cardinals would die suddenly, and their estates would escete to the papacy, conveniently controlled by Cesare's father. One account claims that Cesare mistakenly drank from a poisoned wine bottle intended for a wealthy cardinal and nearly died from the poisoning. The cardinal did die, but Cesare survived, though reportedly with lasting health problems. Lucrezia Borgia's reputation as a poisoner may be largely undeserved, but it indicates how thoroughly the family name became associated with poison. She was accused of having a hollow ring containing poison, which she would deploy against enemies or unwanted suitors. The truth is probably more mundane. Lucrezia was repeatedly married off to create political alliances, and when those alliances became inconvenient, her husbands tended to die, likely murdered on the orders of her father or brother. But she, as a woman, was blamed, because poison was considered a woman's weapon. The Borgia papacy ended when Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, possibly from malaria, possibly from accidentally drinking poisoned wine intended for someone else. Cesare fell from power shortly after and died in battle in 1507. But the Borgias had established a template for the use of poison in Renaissance politics that would be widely imitated across Europe. Chapter 8. Catherine de' Medici and the Poisonous Schools. If the Borgias were the masters of poison as a tool of personal advancement, Catherine de' Medici elevated it to an instrument of national policy. Born in Florence in 1519, Catherine brought to France a sophisticated understanding of Renaissance Italian political arts when she married the future King Henry II. After his death in 1559, she became the power behind the throne through the reigns of her 3 sons, and she reportedly employed poison extensively to maintain her position. Catherine is said to have brought from Italy not just individual poisoners, but entire schools of the dark art. Her personal perfumer, René Le Florentin, was rumoured to be a master poisoner who used his access to cosmetics, gloves, and perfumes to deliver toxins. Gloves were particularly useful for poisoning. Fine leather could be soaked in toxic substances and given as gifts to enemies. The victim would wear the gloves, and the poison would be absorbed through the skin over days or weeks, causing illness that appeared natural. More sinister were the accusations that Catherine maintained a poison cabinet containing dozens of specialised toxins, each designed for specific effects. Some were meant to kill quickly, others worked slowly, mimicking wasting diseases. Some caused madness before death. Some were specifically designed to be undetectable in autopsy. Whether such a collection actually existed is unknown, but the accusations themselves reveal the sophistication that poisoncraft had achieved by the 16th century. The most famous accusation against Catherine involves the attempted poisoning of Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre and mother of the future King Henry IV. In 1572, Catherine reportedly sent Jeanne a gift of perfumed gloves. Shortly after wearing them, Jeanne became violently ill and died. The official cause was tuberculosis, but rumour immediately blamed Catherine's poisoned gloves. The truth is unclear. Jeanne may have genuinely died of tuberculosis, but the story became legend, and poisoned gloves became a fixture of Renaissance assassination lore. Catherine's alleged use of poison was not limited to murder. She reportedly employed aphrodisiacs to control men in her court, sedatives to make allies more pliable, and hallucinogens to extract information or induce confessions. Her court was said to be a place where no one dared eat or drink anything they had not seen come directly from a sealed container, and even then only after testing. The paranoia itself became a form of power. When everyone fears poison, everyone is controllable through that fear. Part 3. The Enlightenment and the Birth of Forensic Science. Chapter 9. The Affair of the Poisons, France's Darkest Hour. In 1677, Paris was gripped by an investigation so scandalous, so widespread and so disturbing that King Louis XIV eventually ordered all the records sealed. The Affair of the Poisons, as it came to be known, revealed that poison had penetrated every level of French society, from the highest nobility to the lowest criminals, and that a network of fortune-tellers, alchemists, abortionists, and professional poisoners was operating openly in the heart of Europe's most sophisticated capital. The affair began with the arrest of a fortune-teller named Marie Bosset, who was overheard in a tavern bragging that she'd gotten rich from helping people get rid of unwanted relatives. The police investigation quickly expanded. It led to La Voisin, born Catherine de Chaise, a fortune-teller and purveyor of love potions, abortion drugs, and poisons. Under torture, La Voisin revealed a sprawling network that extended into the higher circles of French nobility. She claimed to have provided poisons and magical services to numerous aristocrats, including several of the king's mistresses. The investigation, conducted by a special tribunal, eventually questioned more than 400 people and executed 36. But the most disturbing aspect was what the investigation revealed about the casual use of poison in French society. Wives bought arsenic to kill husbands, heirs purchased succession powder to accelerate inheritances, servants were hired to slowly poison masters, and the poisoners themselves operated quite openly, advertising their services to anyone with money. The substances used were often arsenic-based, but the poisoners had developed considerable sophistication. They offered quick poisons for those in a hurry, and slow poisons that would mimic natural illness. They provided detailed instructions on administration, how much in wine, how much in soup, how many doses before death would occur. They even offered reversible poisons, substances that would make someone very ill but could be cured with an antidote, useful for creating dependence or for intimidation without actual murder. The affair of the poisons terrified Louis XIV because it revealed that poison was not a weapon of outsiders or criminals, but of the court itself. He ordered the investigation scaled back and eventually shut down entirely when it threatened to implicate too many powerful figures, including possibly his mistress Madame de Montespan. The records were sealed for nearly 2 centuries, but the damage was done. The casual acceptance of poison as a tool of domestic and political life had been exposed for all of Europe to see. Chapter 10. James Marsh and the Birth of Poison Detection. For centuries, poison had been the perfect crime. Symptoms could mimic natural illness, bodies decomposed, destroying evidence. And even when poison was suspected, there was no way to prove it chemically. This began to change in the early 19th century with the development of forensic toxicology. The breakthrough came from a murder trial. In 1832, in England, a man named John Bodle was accused of murdering his grandfather by putting arsenic in his coffee. A chemist named James Marsh was called as an expert witness. Using the best available test at the time, a crude method that involved mixing suspected poison with hydrogen sulfide gas to produce a yellow precipitate, Marsh attempted to demonstrate the presence of arsenic. But the test was unreliable, the samples had degraded, and the jury was unconvinced. Bodle was acquitted. Marsh was furious and humiliated. He devoted himself to developing a better test. By 1836, he had perfected a method that was sensitive, reliable, and produced dramatic visual results. The Marsh test involved mixing a sample suspected of containing arsenic with zinc and sulfuric acid. If arsenic was present, arsine gas would be produced. This gas was then passed through a heated glass tube, where the arsenic would decompose and deposit as a shiny black mirror on the glass. It was elegant, dramatic, and could detect arsenic in quantities as small as a few micrograms. The Marsh test was first used in a major trial in 1840 in France. Marie Lafarge, a young woman from a good family, was accused of poisoning her husband Charles with arsenic-laced cake. The case became an international sensation. Marie was beautiful, educated, and maintained her innocence with passionate eloquence. But Mathieu Orfila, considered the father of toxicology, used the Marsh test to demonstrate conclusively that Charles Lafarge's body contained lethal levels of arsenic. Marie was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The Lafarge case changed criminal justice forever. For the first time, science could speak in court with authority about poison. Murder by poison, which had been the perfect crime, was now detectable, provable, demonstrable. The Marsh test became standard in criminal investigations across Europe and America. But poisoners adapted. They shifted from arsenic, which was now detectable, to other substances. Vegetable alkaloids like strychnine, morphine, and atropine could be just as deadly, and were much harder to detect with the crude chemical tests of the time. The The race between poisoners and forensic chemists had begun, and it continues to this day. Chapter 11. The Victorian Poison Panic. The 19th century saw poison transformed from an instrument of the powerful into a cheap, accessible tool of domestic murder. The Industrial Revolution had made many toxic substances readily available. Arsenic-based rat poison could be purchased by anyone for pennies. Strychnine was sold as a medicine and tonic. Morphine and laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, were over-the-counter remedies for everything from teething pain to insomnia. And Victorian society, with its rigid class structures, loveless arranged marriages and economic desperation, provided countless motives for murder. The result was a wave of poisonings, particularly in Britain, that created a moral panic. The press ran sensational stories of the arsenic century and demanded legal reforms. The government responded with the Arsenic Act of 1851, which required that arsenic be mixed with soot or indigo dye to make it visible, and that purchasers register their names with pharmacists. But enforcement was lax, and poisoners simply used soap to wash the dye out of the arsenic. One of the most notorious cases was that of William Palmer, the Rugeley poisoner. Palmer was a doctor, a gambler, and a serial killer. Between 1842 and 1856, he's believed to have poisoned at least 15 people, including his wife, his brother, and several friends, to collect life insurance policies he had taken out on them. Palmer used strychnine, antimony, and possibly other poisons. His victims suffered agonizing deaths, with symptoms that included violent convulsions, tetanic spasms, and respiratory failure. Palmer might have continued indefinitely, but he made a mistake. In 1855, he poisoned a friend named John Cook after a successful day at the horse races. Cook's symptoms were so dramatic, his back arched in a rigid spasm, his face contorted in agony, that doctors immediately suspected strychnine. Palmer attempted to tamper with the evidence, bribing the postboy carrying Cook's stomach contents to the laboratory, and even trying to bribe the lab technician. But the poisoning was proven, Palmer was convicted, and he was hanged in 1856 before a crowd of 30,000 spectators. The Palmer case terrified Victorian Britain, because it revealed that even doctors, the very people trusted with medicine, could be poisoners. It led to calls for better regulation of poisons and better training in forensic medicine. But most of all, it revealed a dark truth. The same industrial civilization that brought progress and prosperity had also made murder easier, cheaper, and more accessible than ever before. Part 4, The Age of Chemistry, Poison Becomes Industrial, Chapter 12, The Poison Squad, Testing Toxicity on Humans. By the late 19th century, a new kind of poisoning was emerging, one that was unintentional but potentially far more dangerous than individual murders. The industrial food system, with its preservatives, colourings and adulterants, was slowly poisoning millions of people. And no one knew the long-term effects because no systematic testing had ever been done. Into this knowledge vacuum-stepped Harvey Washington Wiley, chief chemist at the United States Department of Agriculture. In 1902, Wiley launched an extraordinary experiment. He recruited 12 healthy young men, all volunteers, and began feeding them measured doses of common food additives: borax, salicylic acid, formaldehyde, benzoate, and sulfuric acid. The press called them the Poison Squad. The volunteers lived in a special facility, ate carefully controlled diets, and submitted to constant medical monitoring. Wiley was looking for the precise dosages at which these substances began to cause harm. What he found was disturbing. Even small amounts of preservatives like borax caused digestive problems, kidney stress, and other health issues. The colourings and adulterants commonly used in food were not just questionable, they were actively toxic. Wiley's work, though ethically questionable by modern standards, provided the scientific foundation for the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the first federal law regulating food safety in the United States. More importantly, it established the principle that would define 20th century toxicology. Substances should be tested systematically, dose-response relationships should be established, and safety should be proven before public exposure, not assumed. Chapter 13. Fritz Haber and the Birth of Chemical Warfare. The early 20th century saw poison make its transition from an instrument of individual murder to a weapon of mass killing. The man most responsible for this terrible transformation was Fritz Haber. a German chemist of extraordinary brilliance and tragic moral blindness. Haber's early work focused on synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen, a breakthrough that would eventually feed billions of people through improved fertilizers. But when World War I began in 1914, Haber turned his genius to weapons development. He became convinced that poison gas could break the stalemate of trench warfare, and he set out to prove it. On April 22, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium, German troops released 168 tons of chlorine gas from 5,330 cylinders along a 4-mile front. The yellowish-green cloud drifted across no man's land toward Allied trenches. Soldiers who inhaled it felt their lungs burning as the chlorine reacted with the moisture in their respiratory systems to produce hydrochloric acid. They drowned in their own fluids, coughing up blood and pieces of lung tissue. 5,000 men died in minutes. 10,000 more were injured, many permanently disabled. Haber considered the attack a success. He believed that gas warfare would save lives by ending the war quickly. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, herself a chemist and one of the first women to earn a doctorate in chemistry in Germany, disagreed vehemently. She argued that science should preserve life, not destroy it. On May 2, 1915, just 10 days after the gas attack, Clara took Haber's service pistol and shot herself in the garden of their home. She died in the arms of her 13-year-old son. Haber left the next morning to supervise another gas attack on the Eastern Front. The use of chemical weapons escalated rapidly. Chlorine gave way to phosgene, which was more lethal. Then came mustard gas, which didn't kill immediately but blistered skin, blinded eyes, and caused lingering, agonizing deaths. By the end of World War I, chemical weapons had caused over 1 million casualties, including 90,000 deaths. The horror of gas warfare led to the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which banned the use of chemical weapons, but nations continued to develop and stockpile them. During World War II, the Germans developed nerve agents, organophosphate compounds like tabun, sarin and soman, that were far more lethal than anything used in World War I. These agents interfered with the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, causing uncontrolled nerve firing, seizures, paralysis, and death. Mercifully, they were never used on the battlefield, though not for lack of availability. Haber, despite his role in chemical warfare, later saved countless lives. The ammonia synthesis process he developed helped feed billions, but he never escaped the moral shadow of his gas work. He died in exile in 1934, having fled Nazi Germany because of his Jewish heritage, a final bitter irony for a man who had considered himself above all a German patriot. Chapter 14. The Cold War, Poison as Political Tool. The Cold War transformed poison once again, this time into a precision instrument of state-sponsored assassination. Intelligence agencies, particularly the KGB and CIA, developed elaborate poison programs that combined traditional toxins with modern chemistry and sophisticated delivery methods. The KGB, through its covert laboratory known as Laboratory 12 or the Chamber, developed numerous custom poisons. These included slow-acting agents that mimicked heart attacks or strokes, fast-acting substances for immediate assassination, and exotic toxins that were difficult or impossible to detect in autopsy. One of the most notorious cases was the assassination of Bulgarian dissident Georgi Markov in London in 1978. Markov, a journalist who had defected to the West, was waiting at a bus stop when he felt a sharp sting in his thigh. Turning, he saw a man picking up an umbrella and hurrying away. Markov developed a high fever and died 3 days later. Autopsy revealed a tiny platinum iridium pellet, no larger than a pinhead, embedded in his leg. The pellet had been drilled with microscopic holes and filled with ricin, one of the most toxic, naturally occurring substances known. The pellet had been fired from a pneumatic gun concealed in the umbrella's tip, a weapon straight from a spy novel, except this one was real. Ricin, derived from castor beans, is approximately 6,000 times more toxic than cyanide. It works by inhibiting protein synthesis at the cellular level, essentially causing cells to shut down and die. There is no antidote. Death from ricin poisoning is slow and agonizing, involving multiple organ failure over several days. The Markov assassination was meant as a message. Defectors could be reached anywhere, and there would be consequences for betraying the socialist state. Another famous Cold War poisoning was that of Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer who defected to Britain. In 2006, Litvinenko became violently ill after meeting 2 Russian contacts at a London hotel. He died 3 weeks later from acute radiation poisoning. The cause was polonium-210, a radioactive substance, administered in his tea. The amount needed to kill was so small, less than a microgram, that it could not be tasted or seen. But polonium-210 emits alpha radiation that, while it cannot penetrate skin, is devastatingly lethal when ingested. The use of radioactive poison was extraordinarily brazen. Polonium-210 can only be produced in nuclear reactors, meaning it required state resources to obtain. The assassins left a radioactive trail across London that investigators followed like a glowing map. 2 Russian men were eventually identified as the perpetrators, but Russia refused to extradite them. The message was clear: Russia could reach its enemies anywhere, and it did not particularly care who knew it. Part 5. Modern Medicine When Poison Becomes Cure. Chapter 15. Paul Ehrlich and the Birth of Chemotherapy. While poison was being weaponized by militaries and intelligence agencies, other scientists were discovering that the same substances could be used to heal. The key insight came from Paul Ehrlich, a German physician and chemist working in the early 20th century. Ehrlich had a radical idea. If poisons could kill humans, perhaps they could also kill the bacteria, parasites, and other pathogens that cause disease. The trick would be finding substances that killed the pathogen without killing the patient, a narrow window he called the therapeutic index. In 1909, after testing hundreds of compounds, Ehrlich and his colleague Sahachiro Hata developed compound 606, later marketed as Salvarsan. It was an arsenic-based drug designed to treat syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that was then incurable and often fatal. Salvarsan was incredibly toxic. Patients suffered severe side effects, including fever, liver damage, and sometimes death. But it worked. For the first time in history, a specific chemical compound could cure a specific disease by poisoning the pathogen while, hopefully, sparing the patient. Ehrlich called this approach chemotherapy, using chemicals to treat disease. The term would later become synonymous with cancer treatment, but Ehrlich applied it to infectious diseases. His work established the fundamental principle: the line between poison and medicine is not absolute but relative. A substance can be both, depending on dose, administration, and target. This principle found its fullest expression in modern cancer treatment. Cancer cells are, after all, the patient's own cells, just cells that have gone rogue, dividing uncontrollably. Killing cancer cells without killing too many healthy cells is an exercise in controlled poisoning, a precise calculation of acceptable toxicity. Chapter 16. Chemotherapy, the calculated poison. Modern cancer chemotherapy is perhaps the clearest example of medicine's embrace of poison. The drugs used, cyclophosphamide, cisplatin, doxorubicin, and dozens of others, are profoundly toxic. They kill cells, damage DNA, interfere with cell division, and cause side effects that range from uncomfortable to life-threatening. Hair falls out, immune systems collapse, organs are damaged, patients become violently ill, and yet these poisons save lives. The strategy is to exploit the one major difference between cancer cells and healthy cells. Cancer cells divide more rapidly. Chemotherapy drugs target rapidly dividing cells. They poison those cells preferentially, though not exclusively. The challenge is to kill enough cancer cells to cure or control the disease without killing so many healthy cells that the patient dies from the treatment. The origins of cancer chemotherapy lie, disturbingly, in chemical warfare. During World War II, a German bombing raid on the Italian port of Bari destroyed an American ship carrying a secret cargo of mustard gas. The gas leaked into the harbour, exposing hundreds of military personnel and civilians. Doctors treating the victims noticed something unexpected. The white blood cell counts of exposed individuals plummeted. A Yale pharmacologist named Louis Goodman saw the implication immediately. If mustard gas could destroy white blood cells, perhaps it could treat cancers of the blood system, like lymphoma. Working with Alfred Gilman, Goodman developed nitrogen mustard, a chemical relative of the gas weapon, as a cancer treatment. In 1943, they gave it to a patient with advanced lymphoma. The tumours melted away within days. The cancer eventually returned, but the proof of principle was established. Chemical warfare agents could be repurposed as cancer drugs. The poison that had caused such horror on the battlefields of World War I became, in a different context, a life-saving medicine. Modern oncology has refined this approach considerably. Targeted therapies seek to poison cancer cells more specifically, exploiting molecular differences between malignant and healthy tissue. But even these sophisticated treatments are fundamentally exercises in controlled toxicity. The oncologist is a poisoner, but one working with precision, calculation, and the patient's informed consent. Chapter 17: Warfarin from rat poison to blood thinner. One of the most remarkable stories of poison becoming medicine is that of warfarin, a substance that has saved millions of lives while simultaneously killing countless rodents. The story begins not in a laboratory, but in the frozen fields of North Dakota and Alberta in the 1920s. Farmers began noticing a mysterious bleeding disease in their cattle. Animals would develop spontaneous hemorrhages, bleeding from minor cuts that wouldn't stop, internal bleeding that appeared without injury. Some cows bled to death during calving or after routine dehorning procedures. Post-mortem examinations showed massive internal bleeding, but no one could determine the cause. Eventually, veterinarians traced the problem to spoiled sweet clover hay. When sweet clover gets mouldy, a natural compound called coumarin is converted by fungi into decumarol, a substance that prevents blood from clotting. Cattle eating mouldy hay were being slowly poisoned, their blood becoming too thin to clot properly. The condition was called sweet clover disease. In 1933, a Wisconsin farmer named Ed Carlson drove 190 miles through a blizzard to the University of Wisconsin with a dead heifer, a milk can of unclotted blood from the animal, and 100 pounds of spoiled sweet clover hay. He wanted answers. The scientist who received this gift was Carl Paul Link, a biochemist who would spend the next several years isolating and identifying the toxic compound. By 1940, Link had successfully identified decumarol and understood its mechanism. It interfered with vitamin K, which the body needs to produce clotting factors. Without vitamin K, blood loses its ability to form clots. Link saw two potential applications, as a rodenticide and as a medication. For rodenticide use, he needed something even more potent than decumarol. By 1948, his team had synthesized warfarin, named for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, WARF, that funded the research, with the suffix "-arin" indicating its relationship to coumarin. Warfarin was first marketed in 1948 as a rat poison, under the brand name Decon. It was ideal for this purpose. Rats couldn't taste it, so it could be easily baited. It worked slowly, killing over several days through internal hemorrhaging, which meant rats didn't associate the poison with the bait, so they kept eating it. And it was extremely effective, but Link harboured hopes for medical use. The problem was that warfarin was seen as a rat poison, hardly a substance doctors wanted to prescribe to patients. Everything changed in 1951 when a young Navy recruit attempted suicide by ingesting massive amounts of rat poison containing warfarin. He was found collapsed and bleeding. Doctors, recognizing the symptoms of anticoagulant poisoning, administered massive doses of vitamin K, the antidote. The sailor survived with no permanent damage. The case proved two critical points. Warfarin could affect humans in predictable ways, and it could be reversed with vitamin K if overdose occurred. Clinical trials began immediately. By 1954, warfarin was approved for medical use as an anticoagulant. It proved invaluable for patients at risk of blood clots, those with atrial fibrillation, mechanical heart valves, or histories of strokes or deep vein thrombosis. The medication became so respected that when President Dwight D. Eisenhower suffered a heart attack in 1955, his doctors prescribed warfarin. If it was good enough for the president, it was good enough for anyone. The same substance that killed rats in basements was now preventing strokes and heart attacks in millions of patients. Warfarin remains one of the most prescribed medications in the world, though it's now being supplanted by newer anticoagulants with fewer side effects and less need for monitoring. But the story illustrates a profound truth. The difference between a medicine and a poison often lies not in the substance itself, but in the dose, the application, and the intention behind its use. Chapter 18: Botox. The deadliest toxin becomes a cosmetic miracle. If warfarin seems like an unlikely medicine, consider botulinum toxin, the single most poisonous substance known to science. A single gram of crystallized botulinum toxin, evenly distributed and inhaled, could theoretically kill more than 1 million people. it is approximately 100,000 times more toxic than sarin nerve gas, and yet millions of people voluntarily have it injected into their faces every year. Botulinum toxin is produced by the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, which grows in anaerobic conditions, sealed cans, vacuum-packed foods, deep wounds. The toxin causes botulism, a form of paralysis that begins with blurred vision and slurred speech, and progresses to total body paralysis and death by respiratory failure. Before modern intensive care, the mortality rate from botulism was over 50%. Even today, with ventilator support, the mortality rate is around 5 to 10%. The toxin works by blocking the release of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that tells muscles to contract. Without acetylcholine, muscles cannot respond to nerve signals. The paralysis is flaccid, muscles become limp and unresponsive. In severe cases, the diaphragm stops working and the victim suffocates while fully conscious. Given its extreme toxicity, botulinum toxin was weaponized extensively during the Cold War. The United States, Soviet Union and other nations developed botulinum weapons. Fortunately, they were never used in warfare, partly because the toxin is relatively unstable and difficult to deploy effectively as an aerosol weapon. The medical use of botulinum toxin began accidentally. In the 1970s, Dr. Alan Scott, an ophthalmologist, was searching for a treatment for strabismus, crossed eyes caused by overactive eye muscles. He needed something that could temporarily paralyze those muscles to allow the eyes to realign. After testing many substances, he tried botulinum toxin type A. It worked perfectly. The paralysis was temporary, lasting several months before the nerve endings regenerated. In 1989, the FDA approved botulinum toxin for treating strabismus and blepharospasm, uncontrolled blinking. But doctors noticed something else. Patients treated for eye conditions reported that their frown lines and forehead wrinkles disappeared. The toxin was paralyzing not just the eye muscles, but also the facial muscles that created expression lines. A cosmetic application was obvious. In 2002, the FDA approved botulinum toxin, marketed as Botox, for cosmetic use to reduce frown lines between the eyebrows. It became one of the most popular cosmetic procedures in the world almost overnight. By 2020, over 7 million Botox procedures were performed in the United States alone. The medical uses continued to expand. Botox is now used to treat chronic migraines, excessive sweating, overactive bladder, muscle spasticity in cerebral palsy patients, and even depression. The mechanism for depression treatment is fascinating. By paralyzing frown muscles, Botox may disrupt the facial feedback loop that reinforces negative emotions. If you can't frown, your brain receives fewer signals associated with sadness. The journey of botulinum toxin from biological warfare agent to cosmetic miracle illustrates the strange alchemy of modern medicine. The deadliest poison becomes the fountain of youth. The weapon of mass destruction becomes a tool for treating chronic pain. Context, dosage, and application transform poison into panacea. Chapter 19. Venom as Medicine. Nature's Pharmacy of Pain. Nature has spent hundreds of millions of years perfecting poisons through evolution. Venomous creatures, snakes, spiders, scorpions, cone snails, jellyfish, have developed exquisitely targeted toxins designed to paralyze, kill, or deter prey and predators. These venoms are complex cocktails of proteins, peptides, and enzymes that affect specific biological pathways with remarkable precision. And increasingly, medical science is mining these natural poisons for therapeutic applications. Consider the case of captopril, one of the first ACE inhibitor drugs used to treat high blood pressure. Its development began with studies of the Brazilian pit viper, Bothrops jararaca. This snake's venom contains a peptide that causes severe, rapid blood pressure drops in its prey. Researchers at the pharmaceutical company Squibb isolated this peptide and studied its mechanism. It inhibited angiotensin-converting enzyme, ACE, a key component of the body's blood pressure regulation system. The researchers couldn't use the snake peptide directly. It was too unstable and had too many side effects. But they used it as a template to design synthetic molecules that would have the same effect in a safer, more controlled way. The result was captopril, approved in 1981. It revolutionized the treatment of hypertension and heart failure. Today, ACE inhibitors are prescribed to tens of millions of patients worldwide. all because a Brazilian snake evolved a remarkably efficient way to crash the blood pressure of its prey. Another dramatic example comes from the venom of the Gila monster, a venomous lizard found in the southwestern United States and Mexico. The venom contains a peptide called exendin-4, which affects blood sugar regulation. Researchers studying this peptide found that it mimicked the action of a human hormone called GLP-1, which stimulates insulin production and reduces appetite. In 2005, a synthetic version of exendin-4 was approved as exenatide, brand name Byetta, for treating type 2 diabetes. It helps diabetic patients control their blood sugar and, as a beneficial side effect, often leads to weight loss. A whole new class of diabetes medications called GLP-1 agonists emerge from this single component of lizard venom. Perhaps the most extreme example is the cone snail. These beautiful marine snails hunt fish by shooting them with a venomous harpoon. The venom is a complex mixture of conotoxins, small stable peptides that target specific nerve channels with extraordinary precision. One conotoxin, known as ziconotide, brand name Prialt, was approved in 2004 for severe chronic pain. It's 1,000 times more powerful than morphine, but works through a completely different mechanism and is not addictive. However, it must be delivered directly into the spinal fluid through an implanted pump because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier when taken orally or by injection. Researchers are now systematically cataloguing the venoms of thousands of species. A single cone snail species might produce 100 different conotoxins. There are over 700 species of cone snails. That's potentially 70,000 unique compounds to study. Each represents a possible drug candidate that nature has already refined through millions of years of evolution. The pharmaceutical industry is essentially ransacking nature's arsenal of chemical warfare agents, looking for compounds that can be repurposed as medicines. It's an approach that blurs the line between poison and cure until the distinction becomes meaningless. The question is no longer, is it poison, but rather, what can we do with this poison? Part 6. The Modern Age, Poison Everywhere and Nowhere. Chapter 20. Thalidomide, the tragedy that changed medicine. In the late 1950s, a new drug was being marketed in Europe as the perfect sedative. It was called thalidomide, and it was considered remarkably safe. Unlike barbiturates, which were dangerous in overdose, thalidomide appeared to have almost no toxicity. Doctors prescribed it freely for insomnia, anxiety, and nausea. It became particularly popular among pregnant women suffering from morning sickness because it seemed to have no adverse effects on either mother or child. The drug was developed by a German pharmaceutical company called Hemi Grünenthal. Testing had been minimal by modern standards, but the drug appeared benign in all the animal studies conducted. It went on sale in Germany in 1957, and by 1960 it was available in 46 countries. It was sold over the counter in many places, no prescription required. The marketing was aggressive, emphasizing safety. One advertisement showed a toddler playing with a bottle of thalidomide pills with the caption, "This child's life may depend on the safety of Distaval," Distaval being one of the brand names. Then, in 1961, babies began to be born with severe malformations. The condition was called phocomelia, from the Greek words for seal and limb. Babies were born with hands and feet attached directly to their torsos, with little or no arm or leg bones. Some had malformed or absent ears, eyes, and internal organs. The severity varied, but in the worst cases children were born with flippers instead of limbs, looking tragically like seals. At first, the cases seemed random and unconnected, but an Australian obstetrician named William McBride noticed that an unusual number of his patients were giving birth to malformed infants, and almost all of them had taken thalidomide during early pregnancy. At the same time in Germany, a paediatrician named Widukind Lenz was making the same observations. Both physicians reported their findings, and by late 1961 thalidomide was withdrawn from most markets. But the damage was done. Worldwide, approximately 10,000 babies were born with thalidomide-induced malformations. About half survived childhood. The tragedy was compounded by the realization that the critical window of vulnerability was very narrow, between the 20th and 36th days after conception, precisely when many women don't yet know they're pregnant. Even a few doses during this window could cause catastrophic malformations. The thalidomide disaster transformed drug regulation globally. In the United States, the FDA had delayed approval, thanks largely to the skepticism of Dr. Francis Oldham Kelsey, a reviewer who questioned the inadequate safety data. Her caution prevented the disaster from reaching American shores, though a few Americans did obtain the drug abroad. Dr. Kelsey became a national hero, and the incident led to the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which required proof of efficacy and safety before drugs could be marketed. The bitter irony is that thalidomide, the poison that caused so much suffering, turned out to have genuine medical value. In the 1960s, an Israeli doctor named Jacob Sheskin discovered that thalidomide was remarkably effective in treating a painful complication of leprosy. Further research revealed that it had anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory properties. In 1998, thalidomide was approved for treating leprosy complications, with extreme restrictions and warnings. In 2006, it was approved for multiple myeloma, a blood cancer, where it has proven to be an effective treatment. Today, thalidomide and related compounds are prescribed to thousands of patients for various cancers and immune disorders. But the prescribing is hedged with extraordinary precautions. Women of childbearing age must use multiple forms of contraception, undergo regular pregnancy testing, and sign detailed informed consent documents acknowledging the risks. The drug that poisoned a generation is now saving lives, but only with the hard-won wisdom that came from tragedy. Chapter 21. Poisoned umbrellas and polonium tea, modern assassination. While medicine was learning to harness poison for healing, intelligence agencies never stopped using it for killing. The methods became more sophisticated, more deniable, and more terrifying. The poisoned umbrella attack on Georgy Markov in 1978 demonstrated that Cold War assassination had achieved something close to science fiction levels of technical sophistication. The weapon itself was an engineering marvel, a pneumatic gun small enough to be concealed in an umbrella, capable of firing a tiny pellet with enough force to penetrate clothing and skin, but not enough to be noticed as more than a slight sting. The pellet was made of a platinum-iridium alloy, chosen because it was biocompatible and wouldn't trigger an immune reaction. It had been precision-drilled with cavities just 0.35 millimeters in diameter, filled with ricin, and sealed with a wax plug that would melt at body temperature, releasing the poison over several hours. The assassination required careful intelligence preparation. The KGB needed to know Markov's routine, identify a vulnerable point where he could be approached in a crowd, and extract the team before the delayed action poison took effect. The weapon had to function reliably on the first attempt. There would be no second chance. The operation was meticulously planned and perfectly executed. Markov died 3 days later, and the assassin was never identified. The ricin pellet was only discovered during autopsy, and only because doctors suspected an unusual assassination method and looked specifically for it. In most circumstances, such a tiny metallic object would have been overlooked, and the death attributed to a sudden severe infection. Even after the pellet was found, there was no way to prove where it had come from or who had fired it. Plausible deniability was complete. The polonium poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 was even more brazen. Polonium-210 is not just rare and difficult to obtain. It can only be produced in a nuclear reactor, meaning its use immediately implicates a nation-state. Using it as a poison is the equivalent of signing the murder weapon. And yet, Russia apparently calculated that being identified didn't matter, because there was nothing the West could practically do about it. The polonium was delivered in tea at the Millennium Hotel in London. Litvinenko drank it, and the tiny amount of polonium, probably less than a microgram, began destroying his body from the inside. Alpha radiation, which polonium emits, cannot penetrate skin, but inside the body it devastates tissues. Litvinenko's immune system collapsed, his bone marrow stopped producing blood cells, his digestive system failed, and his hair fell out. He died after 23 agonizing days in the hospital. But polonium leaves traces. It's radioactive, and the assassins left a glowing trail across London, in restaurants, hotel rooms, airplanes. British investigators followed this radiation signature like detectives following muddy footprints. They identified 2 Russian agents, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, who had met with Litvinenko and whose movements matched the radiation trail perfectly. The British government issued arrest warrants, but Russia refused to extradite its citizens. The use of polonium sent a message that went beyond simply killing one man. It said, "We can reach you anywhere. We have access to the most exotic and dangerous materials, and we don't care if you know we did it." The poison was not just a murder weapon, it was a statement of power. More recently, the 2018 poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, England, introduced the world to Novichok agents, a class of nerve agents developed by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s, specifically to evade detection by NATO chemical weapons sensors and to defeat standard nerve agent antidotes. Novichok agents are organophosphates like sarin and VX, but they're binary, meaning they're synthesized from two relatively harmless precursors that are only mixed when needed, making them easier to transport and handle. Skripal, a former Russian military intelligence officer who had spied for Britain, and his daughter were poisoned by Novichok that had been smeared on the door handle of Skripal's house. Both collapsed on a park bench, drooling and convulsing. They survived only because they received emergency treatment, including massive doses of atropine and intensive supportive care. A British woman, Dawn Sturgis, later died after her partner found a discarded perfume bottle containing leftover Novichok and gave it to her as a gift. She sprayed it on her wrists and was dead within hours. The Skripal attack, like the Markov and Litvinenko cases, was attributed to Russian intelligence services by British authorities. CCTV footage identified two Russian agents who had travelled to Salisbury on the day of the poisoning. They were later interviewed on Russian television and claimed, absurdly, that they had come to England as tourists to see the famous Salisbury Cathedral. The pattern is clear. Modern nation-states use exotic, sophisticated poisons not just to kill, but to send messages, to demonstrate power, and to terrorise dissidents and defectors. The poisons are chosen for their dramatic effects, their difficulty to obtain, and their ability to generate headlines. The goal is not merely murder, but theatre, a public demonstration that the state's reach is long, its resources vast, and its vengeance certain. Chapter 22. Environmental Poisons, the Silent Epidemic. While dramatic assassinations captured headlines, a different kind of poisoning was unfolding globally. Slower, more diffuse, but affecting vastly more people. The industrialization of the 20th century introduced thousands of synthetic chemicals into the environment, many of which turned out to be toxic in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Lead provides perhaps the clearest example. The Romans had unknowingly poisoned themselves with lead through their plumbing and cookware. But the 20th century took lead poisoning to an entirely new scale. In 1921, General Motors chemists discovered that adding tetrethyl lead to gasoline prevented engine knocking, improving performance and efficiency. Despite vigorous opposition from public health advocates, who pointed out that lead was a known neurotoxin, leaded gasoline was aggressively marketed and became standard. For the next 70 years, every car, truck and airplane burning leaded gasoline spewed lead particles into the atmosphere. Children playing near roads inhaled lead dust. Lead settled on soil and was absorbed by plants. Urban areas, especially near highways, saw lead levels in the environment soar. And lead is cumulative. Once absorbed into the body, it stays there, primarily in bones, slowly leaching back into the bloodstream throughout life. The health effects were catastrophic but difficult to trace because they were so diffuse. Lead poisoning in children causes cognitive deficits, behavioural problems, learning disabilities, and reduced IQ. Some researchers have argued that the rise in crime rates during the 1960s-1980s can be partially attributed to childhood lead exposure from leaded gasoline. The phase-out of leaded gasoline, which began in the 1970s and was largely complete by the 2000s, has been followed by dramatic decreases in blood lead levels and corresponding improvements in child development indicators. DDT, the miracle insecticide that won Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller the Nobel Prize in 1948, followed a similar trajectory. DDT was extraordinarily effective at killing mosquitoes, and its use dramatically reduced malaria deaths in many parts of the world. During World War II, it was used to delouse soldiers and refugees, preventing typhus epidemics. It seemed like pure blessing. But DDT is persistent. It doesn't break down in the environment. It bioaccumulates, building up in animal tissues and concentrating as it moves up the food chain. By the 1960s, predatory birds like eagles and falcons were dying, their populations collapsing. The cause was DDT, which interfered with calcium metabolism, causing birds to lay eggs, with shells so thin they broke under the weight of the parent bird. Rachel Carson's 1962 book Silent Spring documented the devastation and sparked the modern environmental movement. DDT was eventually banned in most developed countries, though it's still used in some regions for malaria control because the public health benefits outweigh the environmental costs. The bald eagle, America's national bird, was nearly driven to extinction by DDT but has since recovered dramatically following the ban. More recently, attention has focused on endocrine-disrupting chemicals, substances that interfere with hormone systems even at very low doses. These include BPA, bisphenol A, used in plastics, phthalates used as plasticizers, PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances used in non-stick cookware and water-resistant fabrics, and many pesticides. These chemicals are now ubiquitous in the environment and in human bodies. The effects of endocrine disruptors are subtle and delayed. They may contribute to early puberty, reduced fertility, increased cancer rates, obesity, diabetes, and neurodevelopmental problems. Establishing causation is difficult because everyone is exposed, there are no unexposed control groups, and the effects may not manifest for decades. But the evidence is mounting that humanity has inadvertently poisoned itself and the entire biosphere with synthetic chemicals, whose long-term effects we're only beginning to understand. This is poison at its most insidious, not the dramatic death by assassination, but the slow degradation of health across entire populations. It's the cup offered not by an enemy, but by progress itself. And we've all drunk deeply. Chapter 23. The Opioid Crisis. Prescription Poison. The 21st century opened with a peculiar form of poisoning, one that was legal, doctor-prescribed, and aggressively marketed. The opioid epidemic in the United States killed more Americans than the entire Vietnam War, and it did so through medications that were supposed to relieve suffering, not cause it. The crisis had its roots in the 1990s when pharmaceutical companies reassured the medical community that patients would not become addicted to prescription opioid pain relievers. Purdue Pharma, manufacturer of OxyContin, launched an aggressive marketing campaign claiming that their time-release formulation made addiction rare. They funded pain management organizations, sponsored medical conferences, and sent sales representatives to pressure doctors into prescribing higher doses to more patients. Doctors, genuinely wanting to help patients suffering from chronic pain, prescribed opioids liberally. Pain became the fifth vital sign, and healthcare systems were judged partly on how well they managed pain. Opioid prescriptions soared. In 2012, there were enough opioid prescriptions written in the United States to give every adult American their own bottle of pills. But OxyContin was not addiction-proof. The time-release mechanism could be defeated by crushing the pills, releasing all the opioid at once for an intense high. People prescribed opioids for surgery or injury found themselves unable to stop taking them. When prescriptions ran out, some turned to heroin, which was cheaper and more available. When heroin became scarce or expensive, they turned to fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50-100 times more potent than morphine. Fentanyl, originally developed as an anesthetic and pain medication for cancer patients, became the drug dealer's best friend. It's so potent that a tiny amount produces a powerful high, making it economical to smuggle and profitable to sell. But that same potency makes it incredibly dangerous. The difference between a dose that produces euphoria and a dose that stops breathing is vanishingly small. Users often have no idea how much fentanyl they're taking because it's mixed with heroin or pressed into counterfeit pills. The result has been catastrophic. Overdose deaths in the United States exceeded 100,000 in 2021 and 2022, the vast majority involving opioids and primarily fentanyl. Entire communities have been devastated. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed. Naloxone, an opioid antagonist that can reverse overdoses, is now carried by police, firefighters, and even ordinary citizens. The opioid crisis is poisoning of a uniquely modern type. The poison was developed by scientists, approved by regulators, prescribed by doctors, and taken voluntarily by people seeking relief from pain. The poisoners were not shadowy assassins, but pharmaceutical executives in suits, making PowerPoint presentations and hitting quarterly earnings targets. The victims were not targeted enemies, but ordinary Americans, workers injured on the job, athletes hurt in competition, elderly people with arthritis, cancer patients, and eventually anyone who could get a prescription or buy pills on the street. Purdue Pharma eventually pleaded guilty to criminal charges related to its marketing of OxyContin. The company was dissolved, and its owners, the Sackler family, agreed to pay billions in settlements, but no amount of money can undo the damage, An entire generation has been scarred by this epidemic, and the poisoning continues, with fentanyl now infiltrating the supply of other drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, even marijuana, killing users who have no idea they're consuming opioids. The opioid crisis illustrates a fundamental truth about poison in the modern world. It's no longer about individual murders or even warfare. The most dangerous poisons are the ones we take willingly, the ones we're told are safe, the ones that come in prescription bottles with our names on them. The cup is offered with a smile by someone we trust, and by the time we realise it's poisoned, it's too late. Conclusion: The Eternal Question of the Cup. Chapter 24. Paracelsus and the Persistence of Paradox. We return, at the end of this long journey, to a principle articulated by the 16th century alchemist and physician Paracelsus. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison. This principle, often simplified as the dose makes the poison, is the foundation of modern toxicology. But it's more than a scientific observation. It's a philosophical truth about the fundamental ambiguity of substances' intentions and outcomes. Water, essential for life, will kill you if you drink too much. Oxygen, without which we die in minutes, becomes toxic at high pressures. Vitamin A is necessary for vision and immune function, but excessive amounts cause severe toxicity. Even table salt sodium chloride is deadly in large enough doses. Conversely, substances we consider poisons can heal in tiny amounts. Arsenic was used to treat syphilis before penicillin. Digitalis from the foxglove plant is a deadly poison that's also a critical heart medication. Warfarin kills rats and prevents strokes. Botulinum toxin, the deadliest substance known, erases wrinkles and treats migraines. The history of poison is not a story of villains and victims, though it contains plenty of both. It's a story about knowledge and power, knowledge of which substances affect biological systems, and power to use that knowledge for healing or harm, for good or evil, for life or death. The same plant that relieves pain can end life. The same understanding that creates medicine creates weapons. The physician and the poisoner draw from the same well of expertise. Only intention, and sometimes only outcome, separates them. Over the millennia we've traced tonight, poison has been many things. It was the prehistoric hunter's tool for bringing down game. It was the ancient physician's remedy for disease. It was the assassin's weapon for eliminating rivals. It was the Roman housewife's escape from an intolerable marriage. It was the medieval heir's shortcut to inheritance. It was the Renaissance prince's instrument of statecraft. It was the industrial age's unintended consequence. It was the Cold War spy's precision tool. It was the cancer doctor's last resort. It was the cosmetic surgeon's fountain of youth. Throughout all these transformations, poison has held a mirror to human civilization. Our sophistication in poison making reflects our technological development. Our use of poison reflects our moral development, or our lack thereof. Our efforts to detect, treat, and regulate poison reflect our social development. The history of poison is human history told from an unusual angle, one that reveals uncomfortable truths about power, trust, desperation, and the thin line between medicine and murder. Chapter 25. The Future of Poison, What Comes Next. As we stand in 2025 looking forward, what is the future of poison? Several trajectories seem clear, each carrying its own dangers and possibilities. First, medicine will continue to mine poisons for therapeutic value. Researchers are systematically studying venoms, plant toxins, bacterial compounds, and synthetic chemicals, looking for substances that affect specific biological pathways. Each new understanding of how a poison works opens up potential medical applications. The cone snail venoms we discussed earlier represent just a tiny fraction of nature's chemical library. Hundreds of thousands of venomous species remain unstudied. Each contains dozens or hundreds of unique compounds. This is a pharmacological goldmine waiting to be explored. Second, synthetic biology and genetic engineering are creating entirely new categories of poisons that don't exist in nature. Scientists can now design proteins and peptides with specific toxic effects, targeting particular cell types or biological processes. This has enormous medical potential. Imagine cancer treatments that kill only tumour cells while leaving healthy tissue untouched. But it also has disturbing implications. Engineered biological toxins could be far more lethal and targeted than anything natural evolution has produced. Third, The environmental poisoning that began with the Industrial Revolution continues and accelerates. Microplastics, PFAS chemicals, pesticide residues, pharmaceutical compounds, and industrial pollutants are now found in every ecosystem on Earth, from the deepest ocean trenches to the highest mountain peaks, and in the bodies of virtually every human being. We're conducting an uncontrolled experiment on the entire biosphere, the results of which won't be fully apparent for generations. This is slow-motion poisoning on a global scale, and we don't yet fully understand the consequences. Fourth, poison as a weapon of assassination and terrorism will likely become more sophisticated and more difficult to detect. The techniques used against Markov, Litvinenko and Skripal represent state-level capabilities, but the knowledge and technology required become more accessible with each passing year. The same tools that enable targeted cancer therapy could enable targeted assassination. The same synthetic biology that promises medical breakthroughs could enable bioweapons. The dual-use dilemma, where the same knowledge can heal or harm, is not going away. If anything, it's becoming more acute. Finally, the philosophical and ethical questions surrounding poison remain unresolved. When does medicine become poison? At what point does a treatment intended to preserve quality of life become a form of harm? How do we balance individual autonomy with public health when it comes to environmental toxins? Who decides what level of poisoning is acceptable as a side effect of industrial civilization? These are not just medical or scientific questions. They're moral and political questions that each generation must grapple with anew. Epilogue. The final question. We began this journey with a question about the cup. When the cup is offered, do we drink or do we refuse? Do we trust the hand that offers it, or do we suspect poison in every kindness? Throughout human history, this question has appeared in countless forms. Socrates faced it in his Athenian prison cell, choosing to drink rather than flee. Cleopatra faced it in her tomb, choosing poison over capture. Mithridates faced it throughout his paranoid life, immunizing himself against the poisoned cup he was certain would come. The medieval peasant faced it at every meal prepared by a master or employer. The Victorian housewife faced it in every medicine cabinet. The modern patient faces it in every prescription, every treatment, every pill. The history of poison teaches us that the danger is real, but the fear can be paralyzing. Poison has killed millions throughout history, but fear of poison has also prevented the development and use of life-saving medicines. Paranoia about poisoning has destroyed trust, shattered communities, and enabled manipulation by those clever enough to exploit fear. Perhaps the wisdom lies not in refusal or blind acceptance, but in understanding. Understanding what substances can do, how they work, what risks they carry. Understanding the intentions of those who offer the cup. Are they healing or harming, helping or controlling? Understanding context, dosage, and purpose. Understanding that the same substance can be medicine or poison depending on how it's used. The cup will always be offered. We live in a world of chemicals, natural and synthetic, each with the potential to help or harm. We cannot retreat to some imaginary pre-chemical Eden. Such a place never existed. Even the Garden of Eden, according to legend, contained a poisonous tree. We cannot live in constant fear, suspecting poison in every bite of food, every sip of water, every medical treatment. Such paranoia is itself a form of poisoning, of the mind, of trust, of society. What we can do is remain vigilant but not paranoid, informed but not terrorized, cautious but not paralyzed. We can demand honesty about risks, transparency about contents, accountability for harm. We can support the science that distinguishes poison from medicine, the regulations that protect public health, and the ethics that guide the use of dangerous knowledge. And we can remember that poison throughout history has been as much about power as about chemistry. The power to heal or harm, to give life or take it, to offer trust or betrayal. The history of poison is, ultimately, a history of how humans use power, over nature, over each other, over life itself. The cup is offered. It has always been offered. It will always be offered. The question is not whether to drink, but whether we have the wisdom to know what we're drinking and why. That wisdom, hard-won over millennia of bitter experience, is perhaps humanity's best antidote to poison. Good night, and sleep well, knowing that the story of poison is not just history. It's the ongoing story of every substance we consume, every chemical we're exposed to, every choice we make about what to put into our bodies and what to keep out. The history continues, and we're all part of it. Until next time, rest easy in the knowledge that understanding the darkness is the first step toward finding light.